Okay, hello, and depending on where you are, good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to Synergistic's Ransomware Bootcamp. I'm Lauren Frickel, Marketing Manager at Synergistic, with a few bits of housekeeping for you before we begin. First, there are a few buttons on the left side of your screen that we'll use today. Please use the Chats button to engage in conversation with other attendees, hosts, or speakers. Note you can chat directly or to the entire group. Use the Q&A button, the one with the little hand, to ask questions about the presentation. This button we will monitor during the Q&A segments of each presentation. And also please note you can message a speaker or host directly. So if you're having technical difficulties, feel free to directly message me, Lauren Frickel. Last, the polling button. When prompted, please hit the polling button to respond to a number of poll questions we'll launch throughout today's session. And note, this session is being recorded and will be available to stream in this Eventry platform by the end of the day. I'll drop a link to the event lobby in the chat for you to bookmark to easily access this recording. And before I turn the mic over to Mac, I ask you remain muted and your camera off until we move into the Q&A segments, where you can then turn them on if you wish. Now let's begin. Mac, I'll turn it over to you now.
All right. Well, thank you, Lauren, and welcome everybody. Before we get started, just a couple of things I'd like to do, and that is, first of all, thank Lauren Frickel, who you were just listening to, and to Carrie Mulcahy, and the rest of the staff that helps to put these things on. These educational events are very important to Synergistic, and it's something that we've always done for the 20 plus years that we've been in existence, because we feel it's very important to give back to the community. And these guys work really hard to put these events on and try to make them a quality event for everybody who attends. Today, we're really very fortunate because, number one, this is a very important topic for all of us to be involved in at this moment in our industry. But more importantly, because you're going to get to listen to two folks who have been very much involved on the front lines of dealing with this issue, just like many of you. And so the first person I'd like to introduce is our first speaker, who is Alyssa Doroff. Alyssa works at Lockton Financial Services. She is a director there, and she handles issues around cyber, tech, E&O type insurance issues, and media liability. And I suspect that she has a lot more skills and experience than that limited description, based on her resume and the amount of time that I've had, few minutes I've had to speak with her and listen to her talk. And look at her slides. So I'm guessing you're going to receive some really great content from Alyssa. And cyber insurance is obviously one aspect of our overall solution that we have out there in our program. So this will be hopefully very educational and very helpful to you to listen to what she has to share. The second person is Curtis Minder, and Curtis is the CEO and founder of a company called GroupSense. He is also the lead negotiator for that organization, and has been involved in many ransomware incidents across the country and around the globe. So you're going to get to talk to somebody who's spoken firsthand to the folks who unfortunately are creating a lot of havoc in our industry from time to time. So you're going to have an opportunity here not only to listen to two people that have a great deal of experience firsthand with respect to this topic, but you're going to have a chance to ask them questions. So I encourage all of you, when we get to the question and answer sessions that'll occur right after each one of them speaks, to please ask questions and to dive even deeper perhaps than where they have gone, or maybe things that are first of mind with you that you'd like answers to. With that, can you go to the next slide for me, please? Thank you. So as I said, Synergistic has been doing these kinds of events for a long time, and it's really part of our overarching philosophy of creating that partnership with the industry and with the hospital systems and vendors and other folks that we work with in this industry to try to bring quality education around the topics of cybersecurity, privacy, audit, etc., to help folks do a better job of protecting their data, protecting their operations, and most importantly, protecting that most critical mission of providing care to the folks that they serve. I'd like to also take a moment here. I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment and thank Chime and Russ Brenzel and his staff for being a good partner and helping us by providing CEU credits for this session today. So for those of you who can take advantage of that, be sure to go out there. It's a self-attestation, I believe, for these CEUs, because there's not more than 10. But take advantage of that, because I know that's always important to everybody in terms of maintaining their professional certifications and whatnot. So we're happy to bring that to you as well. Okay, next slide. So I call this, I kind of tongue-in-cheek said, this is the broker and the negotiator, and again, it goes back to the two people that you're going to be listening to today, who are really the core of this this presentation today, and the experts here, and they're both going to bring a different perspective and a different topic to the discussion. So please, by all means, like I said, take advantage of this and learn everything you can from these folks as they present and then afterwards. And I think you're going to find that there's some pretty interesting things that they're going to say, and hopefully very helpful with respect to the challenges that each of you face in facing these different kinds of events that occur in your environment. Go to the next slide. And the reason I say that is because the reality is this: we can't stop these attacks. I think everybody understands that today. Every day that we get up and connect to the network and go to work, there are folks out there, unfortunately, who are focused on making our lives difficult and taking advantage and doing things that we really would rather them not do, that would interfere with what we're trying to do. This is happening on a daily basis everywhere, and just about every hospital that I talk to on a weekly basis has had one event or another. And in fact, this past week we had a hospital system that we dealt with that had a ransomware event, and in this particular case, everybody thought that it was almost a missed opportunity or a missed event because the ransomware had not actually detonated in the system, and so everybody thought that the emergency, so to speak, had passed, and I'd come to find out that it had not. Actually, the bad actor in this particular case had not actually detonated the ransomware itself, but had already exfiltrated data, and was in the process of extorting the organization. So this is something that happens all the time, and it's becoming more and more frequent. It's become a bigger problem for the insurance industry out there in terms of how they're trying to respond to it, to help organizations with it. And I know it's keeping Curtis busy with respect to helping organizations who are actually involved in these kinds of things. But worst of all, it's actually costing us a great deal of capital, a great deal of money in this country and in this industry. But more importantly, now it's actually beginning to impact patient care, because as we've seen in some of the recent studies, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later when I wrap up the session, this is something that ransomware is something now that's not just costing us money, not just impacting our revenue, not just impacting operations, but it's actually impacting patient care and the quality of that care that those patients are receiving. And I think that's probably the absolute biggest issue with respect to why we need to take this very seriously, and why we need to learn everything we can about how we can do a better job of dealing with this threat. Next slide. So this is a slide I like to always throw up here because this isn't a slide that was actually put together by a chief financial officer from a healthcare organization that had experienced a ransomware attack that actually resulted in their system being down for a little over 2 weeks completely before they got their system back up and running. And you can follow the graph out, but basically what he did was he tried to figure out what was the total impact or the cost, total cost of that event to their system. And essentially what it shows is that it took more than 13 months for that organization just to get back to where they were prior to the event occurring from a financial perspective. That is a huge impact to an organization. And that's really what we're seeing in these major breaches. The smaller ones don't have this impact, of course, but when you have a ransomware attack or something that takes down your environment totally for 2 to 3 weeks or more, it has a major financial impact to the institution. But it also has a major operational impact, and now, as I said, even a patient care impact. So this is a really critical issue that we all need to be very aware of and try to do the best that we can in terms of responding to these events as effectively as we can to mitigate the risk. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa and listen like everybody else and learn something today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mac, and thanks everybody for having me here today. Really happy to talk to you a lot about kind of what we're seeing, what's out there as far as the latest threats. But from a positive perspective, there is a risk transfer mechanism via cyber insurance, and that's something that we're going to talk to. So go ahead, we can go to the next slide. Just a bit about me. Mac gave my background, 2-second version. I'm an attorney by background, been in the cyber tech insurance space for about 16 years at this point. I've worked predominantly on the carrier side in claims as product manager, and now I'm back on the broker side. So day to day, I advise clients in the healthcare industry as well as other industries, really what their cybersecurity risks are and how we can get insurance. And we're going to walk through that today. Mainly the process has changed a lot. It's become a lot more onerous and there's a lot more scrutiny around it, but the insurance is still available. So again, we're going to kind of talk through what the process looks like, what the coverage looks like, and kind of get into what happens when there's an incident. So we can go to the next slide. So today, we'll talk briefly about the history of cyber insurance, kind of how it came to be, what the coverages are, what's available by endorsement, how that's also changing, what the application process looks like, what the claims process looks like, and of course, we'll talk about some emerging risks and best practices. So let's go ahead and get started. We can keep going. Okay, at this point, we're going to ask our first audience poll question. How many of you are aware and do you know if your company purchases cyber insurance? So please feel free to go ahead and vote on the polling button that I believe will come up on your screen. Okay, well, this is really positive. It looks like almost everybody purchases cyber insurance, so that's great. It's nice to know that everybody's aware of the risk, that your company is aware of the risk, and they're making the investment. So really happy to hear that. We'll certainly give some greater context as we delve into the discussion here today. And also just want to point out, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask them. Would love to make this a very interactive discussion. You can do that by hitting the Q&A button on the left. So feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions at any point. Okay, great. So let's get to our, we can keep going. Let's go to our next slide. Okay, so I just thought we could, I know Matt kind of set the stage before, thought we could also just go through just some numbers. It's kind of astounding. We hear these attacks, we hear about ransom all the time. I want to focus on the fact that it's not just ransom. Obviously, that's a huge part of what we're seeing. That's a huge reason that cyber insurance has gotten more expensive, and the coverage has become, more and more refined. But it's not so much these, catastrophic events. Yes, they happen, and they're the ones we hear about in the news, but it's more of a frequency issue. It's not so much a severity issue. So, you'll see here the average cost of a data breach is $3.86 million. Of course, that is for entities of all sizes and across all industries. 96% of organizations increased their cybersecurity spending in 2020. That is a really positive number. I say that because, it's a question we get a lot on the broker side is, what percentage of our budget should be dedicated to IT? And of course, that varies greatly depending on the size of your company, the sophistication, and the budget that you have to spend. So you can see, though, that the majority of companies are increasing their spending. 78% expressed a lack of confidence in their company's IT security posture. That's not surprising. One of the things that I always say when a company's been the victim of an incident before, they reach out to a external forensic or cybersecurity firm to figure out what happened. The IT department almost always wants to say, we did our investigation, this is what we found. It wasn't our fault. This is where the malware came from, et cetera, or whatever the incident might be. And the number one thing I say is, please get a third party. Let that third party, independent third party, come in and evaluate the situation. When you have an incident, your IT department, more often than not, definitely not on purpose, but they something happened, and it was, most likely their vulnerabilities that allowed it to happen. So it's really important that an external independent third party comes in and, evaluates the situation. Kind of an astounding number, 10.5 trillion estimated cost of cybercrime by 2025. We know these numbers just keep going up. Phishing sites that Google has registered, over 2 million. 75 billion internet connected devices by 2025. Kind of, again, not surprising, but these numbers are really kind of outstanding. And also, all of this interconnectivity just constantly increases the threat vectors. 4.2 billion reported to FBI's Internet Crime Complaints Center, and 300,000 was the increase in cybercrime complaints received by the FBI's Crime Center complaints in 2020. And I know my co-presenter is going to talk in the next presentation about when to report to the FBI and kind of what that process looks like. So we can go to the next slide. Just some more stats here that I just thought it was important to highlight. This first one I like a lot, 280 days to identify and contain a breach. It's unfortunately, more often than not, what I hear is companies are made aware of an incident or of a potential threat on their system from a third party, from a customer, from a vendor, worst case, from a regulator. So, it's really important that you're doing ongoing monitoring, vulnerabilities in the network, just so much software out there that is so inexpensive that can really help identify what's going on, traffic that's going in and out of your network. So that, it's not almost a whole year before you realize that, somebody's been in the system taking information, potentially mining for cryptocurrency. Who knows what could happen, but obviously a lot of threats out there. And these are the, all of this time period before it's discovered could be pretty detrimental to a company. The average cost to remediate ransomware, $1.85 million. I can tell you I've personally seen ransomware demands, that used to be 30, 50,000. I think we all know these numbers just keep going up. And another interesting fact and topic for discussion is, there's been a lot of discussion around, does having cyber insurance and those insurance limits create a roadmap for a hacker? And there's differing perspectives on this. My personal opinion is once they're in your network, they can take whatever because they can see whatever they want, they can take whatever they want. But certainly, I still think it's better to have the insurance. But again, it is a discussion, and it is kind of an interesting topic and perspective on that. We saw the $5 billion was the penalty imposed on Facebook for privacy practices. 281,000 notifications to regulators since GDPR went into effect. There's no shortage of regulation out there. I think, we're going to talk a lot about network security controls and best practices, but what a lot of times companies don't focus as much on is the privacy aspect of it. And now with GDPR going into effect almost 2 years ago at this point, you had the California Consumer Privacy Act. You then had the the CPRA, which came out to amend the CCPA. And now you have Virginia and Colorado with their own regulations and laws regarding information being kept secure, right to opt out, that people know what is being done with their information. So you can see that this is obviously not something that's going away and just becoming incredibly more onerous on companies as far as taking this information and keeping it secure. Obviously for all of you in the healthcare industry, there's no shortage of fines and penalties being assessed by OCR. And certainly we see that they are one of the, the most enforceable as far as these breaches and fines and penalties, and obviously healthcare records being so critical and so private. So again, just some more stats. I won't go through all of them, but just noting that there are lots and lots of records. I think we all know that, and lots of areas in which different types of records can be indicated and potentially compromised. Let's go to the next slide. Again, just some more stats. These are specific to ransom, based on a number of companies that, these are associated with 100 claims. Of those 100 claims, you can see that 45% of companies paid the ransom. The average ransomware payment was just shy of $1.5 million. Median payment was $600,000, and you saw a 40% increase of $1 million. So you see that these numbers are really going up. One thing that's important to realize here, and it's a question I get all the time too, and I know my co-panelists can speak to this, but the reason to pay the ransom, that comes up a lot. And I spoke to a company yesterday, and they said, well, for a number of reasons, we just don't believe we should ever pay a ransom. And that's an interesting perspective. I can totally agree with that. I can understand that you're funding terrorism, so to speak, but at the end of the day, it's truly a business decision, and a lot of companies have not done truly a test in terms of how long can we afford to be down, and what is that revenue loss. Yes, I get it. You don't want to pay the ransom. You don't want to pay the hacker. But every minute, every hour that a company is down, they're losing revenue. And that revenue loss could be way in excess of paying that actual ransom. One other thing I want to point out is, OFAC has issued guidance that came out and is constantly, being updated as far as who's on their sanction list and who can and cannot be paid. And I think a lot of times companies misinterpret that, or the public might misinterpret that to mean that they can, that they can't pay a ransom at all, and that's not the case. That is not the case at all. You just can't pay any entity or any hacker that's on that sanctioned list. So obviously due diligence needs to be done, and most of the, if not all, cybersecurity firms and forensic firms that are involved in these negotiations understand, that they need to do that and make sure they approve and go by that checklist. And you can see, again, the business interruption exposure, could way exceed the actual ransom payment. So we can go to the next slide. So, with all of that said, there's a lot of threats, a lot of, potential for big numbers, big loss of data. And again, this just highlights some other liability. We focused on some of these these numbers, and they're intended to scare you. And the good news is, we'll get to it in a minute, but there is insurance that's still available as a risk transfer mechanism. But the threats it's not just ransomware, it's not just hackers, but there's a liability exposure. You have liability to customers, vendors, there's consumers. There's so many factors here that are not just your own, as an entity, your own risk. It's all of these potential liability. If you process credit cards, you can get assessed with these really hefty fines and penalties by the PCI DSS, the payment card industry. Increased regulatory scrutiny, as I said, it's constantly evolving. GDPR, CCPA, CPRA, Colorado, Virginia. There's no consistency, but no shortage of fines and penalties either that can be assessed. There's also, breach notification requirements. It's kind of funny, in some of these really large scale breaches, you think of, okay, I'm not going to, you have $10 million of insurance limits. Let's think of some of the really, really big breaches we saw. I mean, Equifax, Target, Yahoo, the bigger ones from a few years ago, but you think of that and it's, oh my God, $10 million in stamps alone just for notification. So, the dollar amounts just, consistently add up for all of these. Business disruption and interruption. And of course, that's what we talked about, is that potential revenue loss for any disruption to your day-to-day operations and your network being taken offline. We can go to the next slide. And I just, here, I didn't go into all of them, and these were pretty much a lot of the ransomware events in the beginning part of the year that made the news, but you could just see there's no, it's not, no industry is immune. Basically, you can see that it's everything from financial institutions to, water treatment plants to, manufacturers to, computer makers, technology companies. There's obviously, we see retail financial institutions, we see healthcare targeted, but these are, just again, a nice display of the fact that, this is what we're seeing. And one thing I want to highlight here too is historically, we've seen that the more regulated industries have been the ones that are more heavily targeted, A, because of the type of data that they hold, and B, just because of the large amounts of data that they hold. But what we've seen, and personally over the last year, I have seen construction companies and manufacturing companies get it harder than any of these other industries. And, it's interesting because they're not being targeted for the PII that they have, the healthcare information, the financial information. They're being targeted truly because somebody wants to disrupt their supply chain. And that is truly a business interruption exposure and a revenue loss versus, a breach of PII. So, again, all industries being targeted, and, that's what we're seeing here. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're now at our second polling question. And this question is, has your company been the victim of a cybersecurity incident? So I'm curious what the answer is there. So if everybody wants to go ahead and vote on that one. Okay, so this is an interesting one. We're getting pretty split. So as these numbers come in, okay, we'll give it 2 more seconds. There we go. Okay, this is really interesting. So 50%, an exact even 50% of you said no, which is great. I'd say 12% said you were not sure, 12% not at liberty to disclose, and just shy of 30% said yes. So it's really interesting to see, and that's, it's positive for those of you that have experienced a breach, not a breach, I'm sorry, but a cybersecurity incident, and you kind of walk through it. I think you kind of know lessons learned in terms of what's what to do, what not to do, and so we're going to walk through that. So very interesting to see, and I'd be curious if anybody wants to share their perspective or ask a question on that. So we can go ahead and launch into the next slide. So here we talked a lot about the scare tactics and kind of what's out there, but like I said, the positive news is the cyber insurance is still a very viable risk transfer solution. The process to procure the insurance has definitely gotten more difficult. That's where, working with myself or a really good broker who's well-versed in the cyber tech space can walk you through it and really explain kind of, why you need it and how it can help. And so, interestingly enough, the cyber insurance itself was developed in the late 90s. And this came out of the technology errors and omissions policy form. You had, coverage that was designed for a tech E&O, the technology product or service didn't work the way it was supposed to, or it didn't adhere to a certain deadline. And because this was thought to be a computer exposure, it was kind of lopped on to this tech E&O policy. So the way the policies still work, and you'll see this in a later slide, is a lot of times you have a blended form. And what that means is you have all of the cyber coverages or data and security liability coverages that we're going to talk about in a minute. But you also have tech E&O coverage. So that's been a blended form, and that's basically where it came out of. You also saw that on the early cyber policies back in the early 2000s, you had a very clear bifurcation of coverage. And so the first party or the reimbursement coverages, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, were historically sublimited. So you'd have potentially a $10 million overall policy, but what that meant was that first 1 million was only 1 million for those breach remediation costs, the cost for the forensics, the PR, the law firm, et cetera. And then you'd have 9 million for liability coverage. And, you know, we've seen that this has changed dramatically for good reason. But, you know, that the reason for that is, you know, now you see, you know, it's a lot more often than not that the ransomware coverage and the business interruption, which are first party coverages, are really where you're seeing the bigger losses. And if a incident is handled well, you likely will not have a liability issue. You likely will not have regulators or attorneys general coming after you asking questions. So, you know, really good reason why the policies have changed so much. There's been a ton of increase in carriers in the space. And so, you know, there were a handful back in the early 2000s, and now there's just over 200 carriers, 200 insurers that claim to be writing cyber insurance on a primary basis. And it's really interesting because, you know, the number one thing I look for is, do they have a dedicated claims team? Do they have a broad panel of breach response vendors when a company has an incident? Because truly, we all know that's where the rubber hits the road. It really doesn't matter. You can have the best policy in the world, but if at the end of the day you have an incident and there's nobody there to help you through the incident, the coverage itself is useless. So, you know, interesting fact there. And GWP, the gross written premium, went from, you know, 2 billion to, you know, just over 7.5 billion is forecasted for next year. So, you know, there's still a ton of premium that's being generated in the marketplace. We can go to the next slide. So this is just, there's a lot of information on here, but I just kind of wanted to walk through. I know the good news is most of you on this call do have cyber insurance. So, you know, I don't need to go through the, you know, in granular detail, but I did just want to walk through, and so you can see, you know, how the coverage works. So on the left side, you'll see these are the first party coverages or the reimbursement type coverages to you, the entity. And this is where you're going to have that true crisis management. You know, that's typically going to be the first coverage that is always implicated. That's where, you know, immediately you're going to need to retain expert legal counsel. That legal counsel is going to retain the forensic firm. Forensic firm will do their investigation. Of course, you know, then that's where you determine, based on the type of information that's been compromised, do we have a notification and credit monitoring situation? Is this a large enough incident where we need to bring in a PR firm to disseminate a message? Those are really the most important coverages here. Also, we have data recovery. You know, that's kind of an older coverage. That was where, you know, you try and restore data if it was a threat. You know, what we're seeing now is it's not just data recovery. It's, you know, the extortion and ransomware, and that's the most impacted coverage in addition to crisis management. And almost always these all go hand in hand. So you're going to have, you know, you potentially have a ransomware issue. You need to conduct a forensic investigation. That goes to crisis management. And then, of course, you know, you potentially have a business interruption exposure, and that business interruption is that revenue loss. Two other coverages that, you know, I wanted to highlight here. It's, you know, a lot of times we talk about business interruption being your own business that's disrupted, but there's also dependent business interruption, and that's a little more attenuated. So that is not just your own network that's potentially implicated, but you have a vendor, that one of your critical vendors. A perfect example, we saw AWS was down yesterday, or 2 days ago, I'm sorry. And so that created a huge outage for a number of companies. So it's not just the policy that responds to your own network being down, but if your critical vendor knocks you offline or makes you inoperable to some extent, that's, you know, the policy would respond just the same. And these policies function from a business interruption and dependent business interruption coverage similar to how they are on a property policy, where after a waiting period of, you know, anywhere from 10 to 24 hours, these waiting periods have gone up on the cyber policies. They used to be as low as 6 to 8 hours because of the increase in ransomware. We've seen this is now, for the majority of carriers, anywhere from 18 to 24 hours. So you do see that, you know, it's gone up. But after that waiting period, the policy itself does kick in to start reimbursing you for that lost revenue, as well as extra expenses, you know, any vendors you need to bring in to get you back up and running as quick as possible. Also, system failure. System failure is a broader trigger. So we see business interruption exposure a lot from a, you know, a denial of service attack or a ransomware attack. System failure is also known as administrative error, and that's basically, you know, somebody comes in and pulls the plug on a server. I mean, it's nothing that basic, but we do see that, you know, system failure doesn't require anything to happen to the actual network. It could just be a mistake. It's not, as by virtue of a patch not going through the way it was supposed to. It's more, just something happens. So those are the bulk of the first party coverages. On the right, you see the liability coverages. And this is where we get into more, again, like I said, the blended tech E&O, privacy and cybersecurity. This is where there is most likely a breach, and you do have class action litigation. And so that would pay for, all of those defense costs and any funds that need to be paid into a consumer redress fund and or a settlement. That's the liability coverage. A lot of times also on these policies, you have internet media liability. So not broad media like a publisher, but you have coverage for copyright, trademark, defamation, misappropriation, name or likeness. That's sort of media liability. Typically, it's going to be something that's on a website that the company maintains. And then, of course, the regulatory coverage. That's also, really important regulatory, very important liability coverage. So you're going to have coverage for, inquiries from any regulatory body, whatever that costs, any fines that need to be paid, to the extent they're insurable by law. But that is that coverage. And then you also have coverage for if you process credit cards, PCI fines and penalties. And like I said, the interesting thing with PCI is that's made up of, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, the major credit card companies. They're the ones who also determine if you're in compliance. But at the same point, the second you have a breach or an incident, you're no longer in compliance. And so it's kind of an interesting dynamic there, because it's the body that oversees and determines your compliance, and then is the same one that, assesses the fines that you then need to appeal to. So it's almost as if there is no appeal process there. But just another another liability coverage that is available on the policies. We can go to the next slide. So we talked a lot, those are the base coverages. What we've seen over the last 3 to 5 years is an evolution of other types of coverages that are not straight cyber coverages that have now made their way onto the cyber form. So for example, you have consequential reputational harm coverage. This is, your loss of consumer trust, brand devaluation, adverse publicity that causes you to lose revenue. The interesting thing with rep harm, and I say this, in the years that this has been a throw on the cyber policies, I've never seen any claims. In fact, I don't think that there are any. And the reason is because it's so hard to quantify. Truly comes down to a forensic accounting, as does a business interruption loss. And this is very closely tied to a business interruption revenue loss, is really, what we've seen with a lot of the large publicly traded companies that have had large scale breaches. Their stock has come back. We saw that with Target was a perfect example. They might have seen a hit initially, but 6 months later, they completely rebounded. Same thing with Yahoo, same thing with some of the other publicly traded companies. So it's an interesting coverage, but it's one you really don't see any claims. Then the next few of these, social engineering, invoice manipulation, cryptojacking, and telephone fraud, these are all cyber crime coverages. And the majority of these were, with the exception of cryptojacking, social engineering is almost always available on a crime policy. But to see it on a cyber policy is really something of a newer thing. And it functions the same. Someone is deceived, an employee of the company, into sending money to, the wrong vendor. And at the end of the day, they're out funds because they didn't pay the vendor. You will see that these are sublimited heavily on the cyber policies. So even if you have a $10 million overall limit, you're seeing that, the most you're going to find for these coverages bundled together is typically $250,000. It's a nice add-on. I will say for financial institutions, carriers are beginning to do away with that entirely because they've seen a lot of losses and they're clearly not getting the premium for it. But it's, it is still available. It's just being scaled back. Invoice manipulation, kind of the opposite of social engineering, where, your vendor doesn't get paid through, you send the money instead of you sending the money to someone else. Your vendor sends the money, not to you. So it's almost as if the vendor's deceived, you don't get the money you're owed, and that goes somewhere else. That's the invoice manipulation. Cryptojacking, somewhat similar to a business interruption claim because they're using your computer to mine for cryptocurrency. So obviously materially slowing down your network. Again, we have not seen any claims in this regard yet. I do potentially think that they are coming, but again, nothing as of this point. Telephone fraud, similar to social engineering, just done over the phone. Where somebody tricks somebody over the phone to, send funds to the wrong place. Bricking coverage is really interesting. This is essentially a property damage coverage. And so the term evolved from somebody, basically, the software is useless and the hardware is rendered useless as a brick. So basically, instead of trying to replace the software, they'll actually replace the hardware. So give you new computers if the software can't be brought back. GDPR, that should say CCPA, and BIPA. BIPA is a really interesting one. This is the Biometric Information Privacy Act, and this act came out of Illinois. It's been around for a really long time, but only in the last few years have we really started to see claims. And a lot of these are employee-related claims towards their employers, where employers are capturing retina scans, they're capturing fingerprints, where employees clock in and clock out, and they're not being told what's being done with their data, who it's being shared with, and how it's being stored. And there's a lot of class action litigation in this regard. So just, another one that the plaintiffs bar came out with to try and make money, but they have been very successful. We've seen a lot of claims in this regard. And voluntary shutdown. This is another interesting one. This is basically where, instead of waiting for your network to be completely taken offline by a third party, by a hacker or a denial of service attack, et cetera, it's, somebody in the C-suite makes the executive decision that instead of allowing whatever's in the system to perpetuate, we're just going to shut it down. And that is something that the carriers do allow. And it's also an endorsement that's readily available. So beyond the basic coverages, these are kind of all the ones that you're seeing are being added by endorsement. We can go to the next slide. So in addition, we talked a lot about what the policies themselves cover. But the interesting thing is, in addition to the policy form itself, policies now provide, and it's obviously there's motivation for this, proactive services. So the carriers in and of itself, while you're an insured and you're on risk with them, a lot of them provide a lot of these free services and or a lot of these services at a heavily discounted rate. One of the ones that I think is great is a tabletop exercise. And a lot of companies a lot of carriers don't do this because it's pretty expensive. But before COVID, this was typically a 4-hour on-site exercise with a law firm. I always recommend a law firm instead of a cybersecurity firm if you're going to go with one. But if you can spend the budget, then ideally you have them both together. You have the law firm and the cybersecurity firm, and you'll have the members of your C-suite. You'll have your marketing team. You'll have your legal. You have whoever needs to be involved that's in your business continuity plan. And it's basically a true test of your business continuity plan. A breach scenario will be presented, and it's as if it's a real situation, and everybody kind of has to act their role and see how did they respond. At the end of the day, you kind of walk through that with the law firm, and you get a, not usually a written report for a number of reasons, but you kind of walk through what was done well, what was done not so well, and really how can we, improve that going forward. Also, one of the #1 questions that's asked on cyber applications these days, there's a ransomware supplemental application, and a lot of that gets into, having MFA in place, endpoint detection and response. So a lot of the cyber carriers do provide assistance and discounted rates where you can obtain all of these services, best practices, dark web monitoring, employee sentiment, lots of aspects that are being analyzed to really try and understand what's being seen on a company's network, or by that matter, not seen. And so that's really, how they help in that regard. And then some of these other, cybersecurity, e-learning and phishing. And, one of the other questions asked all the time on an application is, how often do you conduct privacy awareness training? And you'll see that most companies say that they do. Interestingly, though, they don't track the click-through rates. And I almost, I feel like that's useless. If you're not tracking it and then following that up with some targeted privacy awareness training, how do you know your employees aren't going to, fall prey to that same scam or even something similar, later on? So a lot of these services are available. It's nice to point them out because a lot of companies don't even know, if their brokers don't make them, don't let them know, they don't even know these services are available. And again, they're free, or they're at a steeply discounted rate. So if you do purchase the insurance, I strongly encourage you all to ask your broker, ask your carrier, what services do you provide for free, and how do we make sure we're maximizing our use of them. So great, just some great tools. We can go to the next slide. Okay, now this is very interesting how the insurance is underwritten. So it used to be a very straightforward process. You would fill out an application, would ask, how many employees do you have? How many records do you have? What types of records do you have? Who are your critical vendors? What do your contracts look like? Pretty, basic questions, your revenue, your industry. This has become, because of the large number of claims that the carriers have seen over the last few years, this process, like I said, I don't want to dissuade anyone who doesn't purchase from purchasing, because it's a great process to go through and helping you identify your security risks when you apply for the insurance, but it's become incredibly more onerous. And again, that's where a really good broker can help you walk through this process and really help you quantify your risk and help you determine what is the appropriate amount of risk transfer. So in addition to, these questions here, there's also a ransomware supplemental application. So you'll have a main new business application for data security and privacy, or however the carrier terms it. But you're also going to have typically a 1 to 3 page separate questionnaire that's going to ask questions specific to your ability to recover from ransomware. Questions such as, what is your recovery time objective? What is your, do you have an incident response plan that's specific to ransomware? Do you have a law firm? Do you have a vendor? Do you have, what is your plan if there's an incident? They ask about, it is now mandatory that companies of all sizes and all industries have MFA on any remote devices getting into the network through the vendors, employees. Any device that's accessing the network must have MFA in place. There must be an EDR tool, endpoint detection and response. There must be a way that it's monitoring for anomalous behavior. Do they have a practice to segregate end of life software? And if it's even still being used, why is it being used? Is their email identified as suspicious? Does it go to a quarantine? Questions such as this that are very specific and often are not yes, no, but explain this process. Do you conduct privacy awareness training? How often do you do it? How often do you test your business continuity plan? So these all have to have, positive answers, and there has to be some authentication provided to really validate that. So that's kind of what goes into the process. And then from there, typically, you'll get a number of quotes from, like I said, there's a large amount of carriers in the space. We're just seeing that a lot of the coverage is kind of being tailored back. One thing also to mention is with respect to ransomware, cyber extortion and ransomware and that specific insuring agreement, what we've seen is some of the larger carriers are now cutting back on that. So instead of having, a full 10 million of limit or a 5 million based on your aggregate limit, AIG, for example, they were one of the first to say, nope, we're only going to offer, if you have 5 million, we're only going to offer 50% of coverage. So that then jumps from 5 million to 2.5 million. In addition, to make it even worse, they then add co-insurance. So for every dollar they're spending, you're spending $1. So you're really seeing that the carriers are cutting back on this. And I will say I've had clients ask, I want to get the insurance, but I don't think I need ransomware. And I will tell you, I will never recommend it. But I will ask the carrier what the discount and premium will be. And I can say that it is never worth it. It is typically a nominal discount for one of the most valuable coverages. So again, people trying to save money because the coverage has become more and more expensive. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, and so this is like as I said, the coverage is just getting more and more expensive, and this is a conversation I am having every single day. You talk to a company that has had year over year no change in revenue, no change to operations exposure, no M&A activity, no claims, and they're still seeing year over year their increase is going to be anywhere from, at best, 50 to 75%, all the way up to 200% increase. So I'm having to justify, and say to a company, it has nothing to do with your unique risk and your security controls and procedures. It's really what the market is seeing and the market's way of trying to recapture all of the lost premium from all the claims that they've paid over the last couple of years. So again, it's really, unfortunately not attributable to any one industry sector or any one, revenue band. It's across the board, and that's being mirrored in companies, in every company seeing a huge increase. So that's kind of what you see here. We can go to the next slide. So here, this is interesting. So we've talked a lot about the coverage. We've talked a lot about what's available as far as tools and resources, but this is really, okay, what happens now? All of a sudden, you realize you've been the victim of an incident. And so here, if you purchase the insurance, the number one thing to do is put your carrier on notice. A question I get all the time is, I think we have an incident, but it doesn't rise to the level of a breach. And, I'm afraid of I don't want to let my insurance company know because I'm afraid my premium's going to go up. Bad decision, always a bad decision, no matter what. You might think it's a nothing, and hopefully it is nothing. But if you don't put the carrier on notice and 3 months later, you have a bigger incident and forensics comes in, they start their investigation and say, well, this malware has been in the system for 3 months and you guys knew this then, all of a sudden you have a late notice issue and you have no coverage. So no matter what the incident might be, as nominal as you think it might be, it's always important to make sure you put your carrier on notice and let them make that determination. So again, quick response, you want to do right. You want to manage this. As I said, a really good breach response stems off the need for lawsuits and regulatory inquiries. You want to gather your team, review the incident response plan and call the carrier's 800 number. For cyber insurance policies, I know some of you did experience a claim, and I hope you had a positive result with your carrier. They are manned 800. These 800 numbers are manned 24/7, and you will get a response typically within an hour of you call, you leave a voicemail. That's the way it works, and they will they'll call you right back, and immediately they will debrief and say, what do you think happened? A lot of times companies really don't know what happened, and that's fine. That's that's the beginning. That's the scoping call, and so at that point, the claims team at the carrier is going to partner immediately with expert privacy counsel and really figure out, okay, 99% of the time, forensics will need to come in and determine exactly what happened. And from there, do we have a legal obligation to notify individuals? Do we need to hire a public relations firm? Really kind of helps to determine, what those next steps are and what your response plan looks like. So this is, ideally the way the process works. We can go to the next slide. And then here, the only difference here, this is very similar to the roadmap we just walked through. This is specific to ransomware. And the only difference here is that this is where the cybersecurity firm and/or forensics firm is going to engage in the negotiation and potential payment via Bitcoin. We all know ransom is always demanded in cryptocurrency, and the payment itself, we don't recommend that any company itself have a Bitcoin wallet. There are dedicated vendors that have Bitcoin wallets, and it's really important that you go through them. And the cybersecurity vendors that are all on these carriers panels have experience. They know to demand proof of life. They know when to make the ransom payment, how to make it, and how to facilitate that negotiation. And that's all done through this policy here. So pretty much just the same as before, just with the difference being, it's specific to ransomware. And can they, can you back up? Do you need to pay to get the decryption keys, et cetera? So that all kind of plays out here. We can go to the next slide. Okay, we're getting to the end here. So my last polling question, not last for the presentation. Does your organization have a business continuity plan in place? So let's go ahead and vote on that one.
yssa, Lauren here. We do have a few questions in the chat, in the Q&A as well.
Oh, okay. Well, we're almost at the end of the presentation. I'm sorry I didn't see them. So yeah, please. Well, for this one, I'll just answer this really quickly because I know I only have literally a few minutes. The positive news is that, the vast majority of you, 73%, do have a business continuity plan in place. So that's great. So thank you for telling us that. So Lauren, do you want to go ahead and read the questions? I apologize, I can't see them.
For sure.
Oh, I do. I'm sorry. I got them.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Okay. So, okay. The first thing I want to mention, I mentioned before that there was the misconception out there that because of OFAC guidance, you can't pay ransom at all, and that's actually not the case. You can only not pay the ransom if they're on OFAC's designated sanction list. So that's a very limited group. It does happen, but it is not it is illegal to pay it if you don't seek an exception from OFAC. And I will say that those exceptions are almost impossible to get. And it has to really be like a danger to life. And that's the only way basically that they will let you pay if there's somebody on that list. I can say that there was a claim with a telecommunications provider where they said it was, imperative to pay the ransom, and that was not approved. So it's really, you pretty much cannot pay anybody on that list. That's the process. Okay, in general, I have a question here with respect to vendors that specialize in Bitcoin wallets. Are talking about insurance carriers? So no, insurance carriers themselves do not have Bitcoin wallets. However, insurance carriers have breach response vendor panels. That's the whole reason you're buying the insurance. So they have a list of law firms, cybersecurity firms, notification firms, PR firms. Those cybersecurity vendors partner with companies that have access to Bitcoin wallets. So it's not the insurer themselves, it's a third-party vendor, but that is what you're getting when you get the policy. And then in general, what percentage does cyber insurance pay for the ransom? Who pays? So the insurance policy itself, if there's a self-insured retention, after the retention or deductible is paid, the insurance carrier pays the ransom. That's the way it works. If you have the cyber extortion ransomware, which is coverage on these, mandatory coverage on these policies, the carrier itself, the cyber insurance pays the ransom. We're getting one more question. How do we reconcile government? Oh, I think I answered this one with respect to OFAC. Yeah. So okay, so again, that's that. Okay, I have literally 3 minutes. So Lauren, I'm just going to go to my last couple of slides and wrap up pretty quickly here.
Sounds good.
Yeah, perfect. So great. These were just, I'm glad to see, from all of you that the majority of you do have a business continuity plan. That's my number one best practice. But again, really just understand where your data is, train employees, have MFA. I mean, some of these are so basic, but I'm shocked sometimes that I do talk to companies and they don't have these in place. So really train your employees, patch vulnerabilities, having endpoint detection and response, understanding framework, aligning to NIST, which or other relevant frameworks depending on what your industry is. But there's plenty out there that are publicly available and can provide some really good standards that you need to adhere to. And I believe we'll go to the last slide. Just more, having patch management, VPN, purchase insurance, test your business continuity plan, and last slide. Yeah, we talked. We can skip this one, and we'll just go to the last two on PR. Yep. So best thing I can say is from a PR perspective, we saw some really bad examples with Target and Equifax where they rushed to get the PR message out and said, oh, we think it's 40 million. 3 days later, no, we think it's 110 million individuals. And all that does is confuse your client base and your consumers and have them lose trust in you. The best is really just put the message out. We've been the victim of an incident. We're investigating. We will do everything we can to make our customers whole. And as soon as we have more information, we will be more forthcoming. It's better just to say what you know instead of jumping to get ahead and saying the wrong message, because that's, of course, where you're going to get hit with all these inquiries from the attorneys general and lots of regulatory inquiries and potential fines and penalties. So with that, I'm pretty much at my time. So I just want to thank thanks Synergist for Synergist Tech having me here today. Thank everybody for your participation, and my contact information is available. So if anybody has any specific questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly. Feel free to reach out to Lauren or anybody, and I'll do my best to get back to you. So thanks so much, and thanks for having me here today.
Hey, Alyssa, this is Mac. I'd like to ask you one question directly, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So one of probably the biggest question I get asked by customers all the time is, how much cyber insurance should I carry? Right? They're really trying to figure that out because they understand, I think, a lot of the things that you talked about today, and they understand that cyber insurance falls way short when there's a catastrophic event generally. And so they're really kind of trying to figure out, just how much is reasonable? How much should I probably carry given the kinds of things that we typically experience and that it takes care of or helps us to take care of? knowing, quite frankly, that nothing's going to ever take care of the catastrophic. So what's your answer to that question?
Sure. So we have access to, we use a company for benchmarking called CyberCube. There are a few companies in this regard, and what they do is it's called a Monte Carlo simulation, and there's an algorithm that takes a number of factors into account. And in short, what we are doing on the broker side is benchmarking an organization against their peers at a very basic level as far as the industry and revenue. And based on X number of companies, this is what your peers are buying, and this is how it's based. But what CyberCube does is it asks about 13 questions. That's going to ask the number of records that you have, the type of records you have, what types of security controls and protocols you have in place, and it's going to factor all that in, and then it comes up with a really nice report that shows if a loss were to happen, what would it look like? And then there's a nice bell curve that shows, okay, your peers are purchasing anywhere in the 25th percentile, let's say at 3 million, to that catastrophic event that's 300 and something million dollars, they're purchasing 100 million. So in the 99th percentile. So we do have tools and resources that help us on the broker side to determine that. But from a very basic standpoint, we're really looking at, okay, the number of records you have, if all of those records were compromised, what's that going to look like? From a first party exposure as far as the incident, what's a loss hour by hour, what's your revenue? We're looking at what's that business interruption loss going to cost? Then we're looking at if all of those records were exposed and you have class action litigation, what does that look like? What's the potential settlement? What does a regulatory fine and penalty look like? So all of these help us determine truly what your overall exposure is, and from there help quantify what that number should be in terms of how much you should purchase. And I will say that, there's a lot of capacity in the marketplace. It is harder to get. Like I said, the insurance is harder to get, but it is still available. And if you did want to purchase a few $100 million of insurance, you can get it. It is, like I said, it's difficult for us, but it can be done.
So what's the average, though, that you see, say, for instance, across most of your healthcare customers?
Totally depends. I won't give you a number because it's totally inconsistent. It varies tremendously. You have companies purchasing 5 million, you have companies purchasing 300 million. It truly depends on, like I said, how big they are, and how much they want to spend, but more importantly, how many records they have and the type of information that they have, and their how robust their security is.
Yeah. So I notice we keep talking about records. Now that we've got a couple of studies out there, like the Ponymon study and the study from the health system back east that said that they're seeing a direct corollary between ransomware attacks and adverse impacts to patients, to include increased mortality rates. How is that impacting that analysis?
I'm sorry, Matt, can you say that one again?
I said, now that we have a couple of studies out there that are drawing connections between ransomware events and negative outcomes, as to include increased mortality rates for hospitals that have had ransomware attacks, how are you guys factoring those kinds of things into that analysis?
We're not. I'll be honest with you. That's because the cyber insurance doesn't cover a bodily injury type of situation. I mean, we're truly insuring for a financial loss. We're not insuring for bodily injury or property damage type situations. So that's not something that is contemplated on a cyber policy. I mean, that's typically where you'd see that more on a GL type of exposure. So yeah, that's not something that goes into our analysis.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was great.
Yeah. So thanks so much. I apologize. I do very much have to jump, but enjoy the rest of the presentation. And again, thank you all so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alyssa. I know you have a hard stop. Thanks for joining us. Folks in the audience, if you have additional questions for Alyssa, please ask them in the Q&A and I'll make sure she gets them and can provide an answer via email. So with that, I'd like to now turn it over to Curtis. Curtis, welcome.
Hello, can you see me?
We can see and hear you.
All right, great. Thanks for having me. You can go ahead and go to the first slide. So a little bit about me. I spent over 20 years in the information security space. You can tell how long somebody's been in the space if they don't use the word cyber when they say that. It was long before there was an actual job assigned to this role. I was chasing bad guys and routers in the 90s. I've held many roles, from architecture to security architecture to operational roles like penetration testing, things like that. And started this company around 8 years ago. Go ahead to the next slide, and I'll explain what we do. So the idea behind this company was really centered around, it's a little bit unique. About 8 or 9 years ago, we were building tools to find data that left organizations. At the time, it was specifically financial organizations that should not have left. And where did it go? Where did it end up? Why, right? There was a clear ROI for financial institutions, because if I could tell them account numbers that were out in the wild, if you were, being traded and or dumped places, they could then cancel those accounts and reissue new numbers and get in front of fraud cases. And that's really the origin of GroupSense. What we quickly got asked by our clients was, can you do this for other kinds of data? And it snowballed on us. So we built a platform. That platform basically is Google, if you will, for everything that Google doesn't want to index. And it looks for stolen, exfiltrated data from all organizations. Why do we do this? That's, I guess, the more important thing. Why would we want to look for this data all the time, continuously? The hackers that Alyssa was or the threat actors that Alyssa was alluding to that are perpetrating attacks, many of them are effectively operating a business, and I'll talk more about that. They operate a lot like a business. And as such, they try to minimize their cost. They want an ROI, a return on investment. What they're typically not doing, and I'll talk in detail on this too, is they're typically not writing custom malware to attack you. They're not buying very expensive 0-day vulnerabilities on the dark market. They're not. What they're looking for is the easiest way in possible. And often the easiest way in is your own data that you didn't know was out there. And they use it against you. And they don't just use it against you in the ransomware attacks. Alyssa, when she was talking about the different insurance coverages, spoke about all these different, all these other kinds of attacks, like the invoice manipulation, social engineering attacks, things like that. Those are all made very easy by data that has left the network, either maliciously or non-maliciously by an employee. GroupSense as a brand is only really just burgeoned in the last few years, but for a very long time, we were powering the intelligence operations of probably a lot of the products that you already bought. So companies, network security companies, things like that. We had our original go-to-market was 100% what we would call white label or OEM. We just let them take our data and couple it with their equipment. We took a small capital round, and then in 2020, we sort of accidentally became one of the top ransomware response firms on the planet. How that came about, I can just give you the short version for the interest of time. Part of our job is to detect threat actors in planning or facilitating an attack in advance. And sometimes we do this, and we're always doing this for our clients, but sometimes when we do this, we see victims that aren't clients, and we notify those victims free of charge. In one case, right before the COVID pandemic, we did this for a company who was under a ransomware attack. We actually alerted them in advance of the attack. They started shutting down access really quickly because they saw the evidence that we provided, and the bad guy saw that, and the bad guy executed the ransomware. Had about a 30% impact. The good news is 70% was saved because we gave them advance notification about the attack. The downside was there were 30% was meaningful to them as a software business, and they needed our help. We were longer story, but the short version is we were uniquely suited to help them because, frankly, we talk to bad guys every day. Next slide. So why is ransomware such a big problem? Obviously, Alyssa talked about this a little bit, but from a technical perspective, first I'll say a little bit of history on this. It is not a new phenomenon. There have been versions of this kind of attack going back, frankly, to the 80s, where people were mailing floppy disks that would lock a machine, and then You would have to send a money order to Panama to unlock your machine. It was like one person at a time. So the volume was pretty low, but it was effectively the same attack. What's really proliferated this in the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years is one, the invention and proliferation of cryptocurrency. That's been mentioned a bunch, which in the past, moving large sums of money internationally was relatively difficult. But now we can do that almost instantly and anonymously, and that's empowered some of these threats. The other thing is you've heard of the dark web. So dark web is a real thing, and it, like cryptocurrency, affords these threat actors a lot of anonymity to foster these attacks. It also creates marketplaces, which I'll talk about in a second, where a lot of this data is traded and sold for illicit purposes. The last part, and this really has been going on for a long time, I think that the COVID and the pandemic have actually made this a little bit worse for a lot of companies, is what we call attack surface. That's basically the number of options the bad guys have to exploit and get in. I'm not going to go through every one of these on the slide, but as healthcare professionals, you recognize that there are a lot of devices that are connected to the network in a healthcare institution. Many of those devices, and I'm going to talk about this later a little bit, are managed by third parties, and they run specialized software. That IoT, connected IoT device is and the number of them that are proliferating throughout not just healthcare, but everywhere, but certainly healthcare was one of the early adopters of this kind of technology, is giving the threat actors just frankly more options to break into things. What COVID did to proliferate this was, the remote access component. So the administrative employees that are no longer reporting to an office are now needing remote access to their offices and/or systems, and a lot of times that remote access isn't properly secured. I mentioned the third-party vendors. That is a very common attack vector, and a lot of the compliance and regulatory items that really lock down a hospital don't necessarily flow in parallel down to those third-party vendors. So, and as soon as you give the secondary or tertiary vendor access to your network or one of those systems, it sort of negates a lot of the security controls that you put in place because they're inside the network, right? Next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, poll already. And this is a little bit overlap, I think, with the list a little bit, but not too bad. Does your current incident response plan account for ransomware events specifically? I think I'm supposed to answer this too, so I can see the results. Poll number 4. Looks like it's settling in here. So roughly, the answer here for most folks is yes. What we mean by specifically is, and I'm going to talk in detail about this technically in a moment, ransomware events are different than other data breach events. They're different in a lot of ways, and the way that we handle those events and the impact of those events is quite different. And as a result, the incident response plan or the emergency plan that you put in place has to account for these things. And some of those things are very technical, but frankly, most of those things are administrative and sort of business oriented in nature. Next slide, please. So in general, not just healthcare, cybersecurity is often looked at as a sort of an overhead component from a business perspective. The issue with this is, if you could even argue that data breach in the past, prior to the proliferation of ransomware, was not too impactful to business, it still is impactful to your constituents, your data, and obviously, the regulatory stuff are trying to drive better behavior there, like HIPAA. But now it not only has to do with the exfiltration of critical data and PII, but it's got an immediate operational impact. In the traditional business world, that could mean you go out of business. In healthcare, that could mean people suffer, potentially lose their lives. So it's very serious. The culture that has built sort of the healthcare IT systems is going to need to make a fundamental shift to building security programs into their actual architectures as a common business practice. It won't happen to me. So I go around the country and give talks frequently about how companies can avoid being affected by ransomware. I do this all the time. And that bullet is the one I hear the most when I do it. It is, well, look, I'm just a small clinic in rural Colorado. I mean, these guys aren't after me, right? And my answer is always like, well, it depends. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Do you have internet? Do you have money? Yes, they're after you. I'm sorry. Many of these guys are very opportunistic in nature. They're not necessarily targeting very specific business. There's different styles, but many of the ransomware actors are very opportunistic, and they're looking for the low-hanging fruit. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Ooh, 2 polls right away. All right, cool. Are you familiar with the terms of your cyber insurance policy as it relates to data breaches and ransomware response? I'm going to go ahead and put my answer in here. And I'm going to answer honestly because my operations people are, but I'm not. So I'm a hypocrite. Let's see here. Right. And it looks like most of us are in my boat. Let me explain why this is important. And I wish Alyssa was still here because maybe she could comment on it. Having done a lot of these incidents and worked with companies who are undergoing an attack, sometimes during the attack is the first time they really read their insurance policy in the fine print. The problem with that is the fine print sometimes has very specific rules about what you need to do in what order, and usually is time bound. You have to do this within a certain number of hours. You have to notify this person, you have to call this person. And when you don't do those things in that order, in that time frame, it could negate your policy. So it's not, as part of your incident plan, part of that has to be educating the stakeholders who are the key stakeholders in the incident plan, what those terms are and what those guidelines are, and work that into the plan. Thank you. Next slide. Common misconceptions. Obviously, we're talking about cyber insurance a lot, so I won't talk about that too much more. Obviously, I think everybody knows their general liability insurance is not going to help them here. You have to have a specific cyber insurance policy. I have a quick anecdote, a quick metaphor, if you will, on compliance. So, healthcare, like I mentioned earlier, is one of it's a highly regulated industry. The IT systems are highly regulated as well. HIPAA is there to try to protect a lot of our patient data. That's driving a lot of the IT behavior, but compliance is not security. And earlier, in an earlier slide, I talked about how we have to build this into our security programs. The metaphor I like to use is one of my operations leads is he's a former executive at an automotive manufacturer. And we were standing, I think we were standing in Washington, D.C., waiting for a cab, and a very nice luxury car drove by from a very nice brand. And I said, Tom, that car costs a lot. I've owned a couple, and it costs a lot. And the reason why I don't own one now is because it just had all these little, it wasn't major, but they had all these little problems all the time. I had to take it in, maintenance. And it was very expensive, right? Because it's a luxury brand. And I said, why is it that, because we all know that, lean manufacturing, Six Sigma, those processes for quality and engineering and manufacturing have been around a long time. It's a known quantity. That car company has the resources and the same technology as the competing car companies that don't have these quality problems. And I said, why is it that car has all these, despite all those things, that car has all these problems, and the other brand just never has any problems at all, and it's famous for that. And you guys probably are all trying to guess which cars I'm talking about, by the way, which I think is, you probably figured out. And he said, well, Curtis, the difference is quality by inspection versus quality by design. And that's really a lens that I think we should be looking at our security programs through. Compliance alone that is security by inspection. We need to build into our fundamental business practices the security programs and protections to protect our clients. Next slide, please. A friend of mine who's a marketer for a well-known software company came up with a really good phrase that I like to steal here. we call it the ransomware blast radius. So we all know, I think it's obvious, we all know that one of the major impacts of ransomware is stuff doesn't work. Like your systems don't work, you can't use your email. It's an operational impact. But a lot of companies don't consider how many other things are impacted by the attack. Obviously, if you can't operate, you probably can't do business, you're not making money. If word gets out that you were hacked and your processes were, not sufficient, you're going to have brand reputation and damage. One of the things I try to remind companies when we're doing our ransomware preparedness programs is think about the impact. It's always these soft things that are really hard to talk about from a business and quantitative perspective. It's like, but think about if you can't make payroll, what does that do to employee morale? It's hard to find good people, right? So you've already hired them. You don't want to lose them. What does that do to your people? If you can't take orders from your business partners, if you can't process new patients, what does that do to your partners? What does that do to from a confidence perspective in your business? Obviously, there's a loss of data, patient information. You're going to probably be hit with fines, GDPR, HIPAA, et cetera. And then there's also legal consequences. And we talked about the PR component a little bit. I'll probably touch on that again. But because I'm involved in so many of these cases, I have seen how communicating during these cases and after can impact you from a legal perspective, where you suddenly get hit with class action or legal cases from your constituents. So the impact is huge, and the important thing is to think about these things in advance of an attack, and try to understand what quantitative impacts do these things have. It's a hard thing to do, but it's important to go through that exercise. Next slide, please. So, there's a lot of things that are a little bit, that are different about ransomware from a traditional breach or cyber attack. I mentioned the operational impact, but it breaks a lot of things. We have seen even the most sophisticated organizations yelling at each other in the boardroom because they didn't consider a number of things related to the ransomware version of a cyber attack. I'll give a couple of examples. I like to tell stories because it's easier to get the idea across. But like, for example, let's say you're a very large hospital. You have paid, let's say Deloitte or someone, some very large consultant to help you build your incident response plan. You probably spent $100,000 on that thing, right? But then the attack occurs. And this has happened to me multiple times, where I go into the room. I have a process that I go through every time this happens. I come in, sometimes it's virtual, obviously, but I log into the Zoom, if you will, and there's a boardroom full of people. And some of the questions I ask right away are like, look, where are we in your incident response plan? How's it going? Like, do we know the bad guys can't get back in? I have another story for that in a second. Have they locked the doors? Like, is everything on a scale of 0 to 10? How confident are you these guys can't walk right back in here? And the company, one of the stakeholders would say something like, well, Curtis, the problem is the the incident response plan, that's a file. And that file's on a server. And that server's encrypted. It's 200 pages and we didn't memorize it, so we're winging this thing. Simple things like this that people don't think about in advance of an attack cause major problems. Another one is, and Alyssa talked about this a lot, and I don't want to repeat too much of it, but a lot of this stuff is really about understanding your current response and business continuity programs and practicing them. So another one that comes up is we get to the decision time, like, okay, are we going to engage the bad guy or not? And one part of my job is helping companies make that decision as quantitative as possible before we ever engage the bad guy. And there's a reason why we do that. And a lot of times, the companies are a little overconfident. They say, hey, you know what? We've got amazing backups, and they didn't get them. That's rare, by the way, because usually they do. But they didn't get them. We're restoring from backups. We're not even going to. We'll take it on the chin from a PR perspective when they dump a bunch of data or whatever. We'll pay our fines, but but we're just going to restore from backup, get operational. We're not going to talk to these guys, which I'm a fan of because I don't want to pay them either. I was like, good for you. And then about a day later, they come back to me and said, turns out restoring these backups takes 6 months and we need the data tomorrow. Can we still call these guys? Can we still get in there? So there's just a bunch of stuff like that. On the doors really locked thing, so I've seen statistics. My experience has been that threat actors don't attack the same target twice. They just don't. We've been doing it for a couple of years pretty solidly now. Never happened. But here's what does happen. I had gone into an IT services company. They had been attacked. We were negotiating with the threat actors. We got it down to a reasonable price. It was like less than 10% of the original asking price, which is great. That's a great result. And we were getting ready to pay those threat actors, and they got hit again by a different threat actor because that scale of 0 to 10, they were a little overconfident about how well they had locked their network down. And when that happened, the second threat actor encrypted the first threat actor's files that were already encrypted. So they're double encrypted by 2 different groups. Now we have to go talk to this group and get that key, and then we got to go talk to that group and get this key. And guess what? Some of those files didn't survive that. They were corrupt after being double encrypted. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide because there's some redundancy in the slide, so I want to leave room here. Other considerations. So Alyssa talked a little bit about the OFAC, the Treasury Department OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control, thou shalt not do business with list. Part of our job as a responder is to help the institution where the victim, if you will, that we are working with, navigate that. The OFAC list is basically a keyword search on a database from the Treasury Department. The problem with that as the only mechanism for checking OFAC compliance is that the bad guys change their names and they move from groups and they move around, stuff like that. Now, the good news is we're an intelligence company and we know a lot about bad guys. So we can say like, well, I know they're not on the list, but I know where these guys operate from, and it's Iran. So we're not paying them, right? We have that data. The other thing that we do, which is a little bit more advanced, is, at some point in the process, we're going to get a digital currency wallet from them. The earlier, the better, but sometimes they wait till the end to share it. It depends on the group. We do cryptocurrency blockchain analysis to determine where was that wallet created, where is it currently domiciled, and who has it done transactions with in the recent history. Because if we're going to send money to the wallet and it's currently domiciled in Belgium, but every dollar that goes in there just immediately gets transferred to Iran, probably shouldn't do that. The other thing to consider is financial readiness. This is a big one, actually, because and it's increasingly a problem. And again, I think Alyssa would have some color on this from the insurance side, but banks are increasingly less willing to make large transfers to crypto brokers. There's a lot of theories as to why that is, because technically there's nothing wrong with that. The SEC, they have the same KYC, know your customer, AML laws, anti-money laundering laws. So that's all tracked and traced. But there's a number of reasons, but a lot of banks aren't ready to do this. And also administratively inside the company, it can also be an issue where, and then we've had, I'm just kind of shooting from the hip here with anecdotes, but we've had cases where, okay, we're ready to transfer, but for good reason, our business process is this person, submits it, and then these 2 people have to approve it, but one of those people is in Bermuda and they don't have their phone. Okay, well, we need that money over there now. How do we do this, right? And so this is all part of the considerations that you have to make in advance of an attack. Preparation in practice is key. That's why the last bullet is really important. Once you have these plans in place, you have to practice them. TTX stands for tabletop exercise. If you haven't seen that acronym before, big fan of those. Alyssa's, suggested do it with your law firm. I would say, spend the extra money and have a cyber expert there like ourselves who have actually talked to bad guys on a regular basis, who've actually been in these cases over and over and over again as the responder. But practice is key. You do not want to be trying to figure this stuff out during the incident. It's just a lot of pressure, right? A lot of pressure. Next slide. Okay, I'm just gonna, and this might be review for some of you folks. I'm just going to, I'm gonna walk you through kind of what the experience is as a victim. Go ahead. first we're going to do a poll. So, and it's actually a good poll for the next step. So you arrive at work to find you're under a ransomware attack. Everything is down. Who you call first? Does anybody know who they would call first? I have to answer this. I love that we got some Ghostbusters answer. Yeah, I mean, I guess I probably should have put another option on here. It depends, because frankly, it does depend. More than likely, you're going to contact the leadership stakeholder that was identified in your response plan. That probably would be your CISO, and then your insurance company is typically next, and then incident response firm. And the reason why that order is typically because these cyber insurers are going to either approve or dictate who that incident response firm is that you're going to use, and including if we're going to transact with the threat actors, they would, Alyssa used the word panel repeatedly. That's what they call their sort of approved list of responders. I'm on that approved list for many insurance carriers and law firms. So they would say, look, we're ready to help you. Here's a guy to call. He's going to help you out with this. Sadly, I haven't tried Ghostbusters. We should just try that sometime and see if we call them first. But yeah, so that's great. Nobody's calling their mom though, because mom, that'll just stress her out. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when you come in, like I said, you come in the office one day, nothing works, and that means your email doesn't work. You might not be able to log into many of your machines. Your servers are locked. You can't reach your files. But it also means like the fetal monitoring system's down, the charting system's down. All of these systems are probably, the radiology stuff is down. All of the critical systems are not working. They're all interdependent. So if you take, even if the threat actor can't encrypt the files on the radiology machine, encrypt the system that manages it and where those files are stored, and all of the, all that stuff gets interrupted. But on a number of machines, probably spread it throughout, you will still be able to see the desktop, and you'll have it's usually a text file. It looks a lot like this. Here's what it has. It has who the bad guys are, what you should not do, and then they suggest what you should do. And I need to pay attention to time here, so I'm being careful. So the do nots: do not modify, rename, remove files. Do not use third-party decryption software. I just want to say real quick note on that. There's no such thing. Okay, so these guys are using SHA-256 government-grade encryption. There is no such thing as third-party software that can decrypt that. If somebody tells you they have that, it's not true. And there's a bunch of scammers that will try to sell you things that aren't real, and that's a whole nother discussion. But so that's true. So do not shut down or reset systems. Why do they tell you these things? It's actually good advice. Thank you, bad guys. The good advice is good advice because it will damage the files if you shut down your machines, and the incident responders can't do their job if you shut down your machines. And if you modify, rename, it will probably corrupt the file. So they're right. So what you should do, they want you to buy the decryption tool from them. They want you to engage quickly. And on this note, it's truncated here, but at the bottom, they will give you a dark web URL that is custom to your incident for you to visit. And they will tell you how to do that. They'll give you very detailed instructions on how to download a Tor browser, configure it, get on the dark web, and how to reach that site. Next slide, please. And then when you go, this is what you see. This is one of many, but they all are very similar. It looks a lot like a normal web page. I mentioned, that discussion that we have on the front end about how you need to really think about the business, the business impact of this, and come up with some sort of quantitative result to decide whether is it worth it to rebuild or restore, or do we talk to the bad guy? And you want to do all of that before you go to this site. And God forbid this is an incident that you all experience, but if you do, this is so important. Do not go to that site until you are absolutely ready and have decided we're going to talk to the bad guys. And you have in your mind some number that you think is reasonable for you to pay to get out of the situation. Because when you go there, you can see in the upper left-hand corner, there's a clock, and that clock starts ticking down. And there's a thread attached to that clock. Let's not start the clock. Let's wait. Let's not start the clock if we don't have to. It also has a section where they give you sort of a Q&A on how to do the cryptocurrency transfer. Sometimes it'll show their wallet. So where it says Monero address, that is a cryptocurrency wallet. I've just blurred that out because I don't want you guys to send them any money. So I had to blur it out. But they'll give you the wallet. They also, where you see chat support and it says new, it's actually not new. I don't know why it says that on the site, but that tab is where you actually talk to the bad guys. That's where I do a lot of my work. I'm the liaison between the victim and the bad guy. And we talk to the bad guys there. And that all happens over this dark web chat to decide what we're gonna pay. Next slide, please. Quick slide on law enforcement. Alyssa actually said that I would talk a little bit about this. So we always recommend that the victims engage both local and federal law enforcement. There's a few reasons. I'll just go over it quickly. But first, just to set expectations, they're not really going to be much help. The official stance for the federal government is don't pay the ransom. So the first thing the FBI agent's going to say is like, our official stance is you should not pay the ransom, which is fine because it's not illegal. They just have to say that to you, right? And then they'll be supportive, like moral support more than anything. And the idea is we want them involved because we want them to collect what we call the IOCs or the indications of compromise. We want them to collect the wallet from the bad guy because at a macro level, we want the Department of Justice to understand who's getting hit, how bad it is, how much money's going. We want a macro level view of that. And that's what the FBI is really there to do, is to collect information. Now, on occasion, they do bring some value. They do bring some information about threat actors to the table. And again, like I said, it's actually not illegal to pay a ransom. And when and if, so we're going through this whole OFAC compliance process to make sure that we're not paying bad guys. That's still not, it's very comprehensive, the process we go through, but still not perfect because a lot of stuff is done anonymously. It could be, so if the Treasury Department comes back, let's say a few months later and says, well, it turns out that you shouldn't have paid that bad guy. Two things. One, we can say, look, we did due care. We looked on your list. We looked on our own list. We did the cryptocurrency investigation. We did our best to make sure we weren't paying the bad guys. And guess what? The FBI was here the whole time and they had our arm around us and we're friends. And it'll help that your case basically. Next slide, please. This is going to be a little bit repetitive to some of the final slides that Alyssa had, but we've done so many of these and it's really interesting. We get feedback about how the threat actors got into companies' networks in two primary ways. One, we work very closely with the incident response firms, and we usually get a peek at that final report. So those guys are going to try to do their forensic work to find out how the bad guys got in. So we usually get a copy of that. The other thing we do is when we're negotiating with the threat actors, we don't just ask them for the decryptor. We don't just ask them to delete the data they stole. We also ask them for a report on how they got in. And believe it or not, they do it most of the time. Sometimes they're lazy and they say, hey, you use stupid passwords, and that's it. But sometimes they actually give us a report. And not to be too technical, but they might say like, look, there was a reused credential on the dark web. I logged into a VPN and I used Cobalt Strike and got onto your one of your desktops. And when I set on one of your desktops, I ran Mimikatz and grabbed credentials from memories when the domain controller, domain admin logged in, and I pivoted to the domain admin and I pivoted to the backup systems. Then I deleted all those, and they'll just tell you the whole thing because they're really proud of what they did. The whole point of telling you this is that I've distilled down the major ways that threat actors get in and made a list of the things you can do to avoid this. And I'm happy to share this. We don't sell this list out. Like I said, I don't want to pay these bad guys either. But some of this is stuff we've been talking about in the cybersecurity community for decades. It's very simple things. Yeah, the Colonial attack, that was what I just described. That was an employee who used their corporate email address on a third-party site. That third-party site got hacked. Those credentials were dumped on the dark web. That user used the same or similar password that they used at work. Bad guys just logged in. MFA, if first of all, that means their password policies are bad and their credential policies are bad, but also they didn't have MFA enabled on that remote access device. Those three, if you do any of those things, anything in this list, those first three things will save you from 80% plus of the risk. She mentioned training a lot. That's very important. I also want to mention, she mentioned monitoring your network vulnerabilities. That's important, but also monitoring what data left the network, which is what GroupSense does. You want to know when that employee credential ended up on the dark web. You want to know that because then you can go into your systems, reset that credential, and remind that employee that they shouldn't be doing that, right? So you need to know when those things show up, and that's what digital risk protection services do. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through every one of these. I think the most important ones, I'll just pull a few out. I mentioned do not engage. I did want to comment on the PR component. Alyssa had a really good slide about what she learned about this, and I had a client who asked me for advice on this, and it's funny. He said, "Curtis, I'm about to message my customers about what just happened. Can you help me? How do I do this? What do I say here?" And I said, "Look," the guy's name was Walter. I said, "Look, Walt, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a PR person, but I have two pieces of advice for you. First piece of advice is get a lawyer and a PR person. And the second piece of advice is that if I could sum up where I've seen this go wrong and the best way to approach notification, it is you want to communicate as quickly and as transparently as possible to your constituents what has happened within your knowledge boundaries." And Alyssa talked on this. And that means if you do not know it definitively and firsthand, you don't need to tell them. We're still investigating. Things are going to change. But you do need to communicate quickly and transparently about what you do know, the facts you do know. This is going to keep you from lawsuits. We know to contact insurance. We talked about sanction, law enforcement, monitoring. So we talked about all that. The last thing I'll talk about is, why do I exist? Why do you need some special person to come in and talk to the bad guys? I read Getting to Yes. That's a famous negotiation book. I can negotiate. And let me tell you why. One, all of the great negotiation books, and by the way, I want to make a special mention of one of my favorites. If you haven't read the book by Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference, it's a great book, and it actually has helped a lot in our frameworks. And I know Chris now personally, and we collaborate a little bit. But those books, including Chris's and some of the famous negotiation books, the Harvard Business Review books, those books make a few assumptions about what's really going on. They make assumptions that in most cases you have physical access to the person. You have you can see their eyes, you can see their body language, you can hear the tone of their voice. Maybe they're on the phone. It also assumes that there's some leverage on both sides. In this case, the threat actors might have copies of your finances and your cyber insurance policy and all of your data. That's a lot of leverage. You don't know who they are. They're never going to get arrested. They have amnesty from their home country, all these other things. So it's very imbalanced amount of leverage. And then the last thing is, it also assumes that you guys probably speak the same language. And why that's important here is, many times the threat actors you're dealing with, especially initially, they may not speak English at all. The stuff that they're putting in that dark web chat is from a script. And that means when you type back to them the words that you use, they just put in Google Translate. And why that's significant is because you should understand and take care to understand the tone and context that are conveyed in their native language when you use those words. So what does that mean in Ukrainian? How does that come across in Ukrainian? That can cost you money. And also having one who's done this enough times that can kind of tell you the trustworthiness of the threat actor, whether they're going to actually honor the ransom, how long it takes, and having someone who can help you with the crypto transaction. So there is some skill involved other than knowing how to negotiate. I like to joke that I'm really good at negotiating with threat actors. I paid too much for my truck. So it's just a different skill set. Go ahead. Next slide, please. That's it. Oh, how did I do on time? I think that was good. So questions?
Thanks, Curtis. We do have a few questions from the audience.
Sure.
So for the first one, at what point do you recommend notifying general counsel?
Well, that's usually dictated in your response plan, but it is they're among the first people you should contact because mostly because of regulatory components. If you're subject to HIPAA and GDPR, some of those things also have time constraints on them. As far as a lot of these regulations use the word aware. When you became aware, and that is a loaded term in the law firms, and whether it's internal or external counsel, will help you navigate that so that you don't get yourself into legal trouble. So very early in the process, probably right around the time you're notifying the IR person, you're pulling the lawyer in, right? And when you're talking to the attorney and when you're talking to the incident responders as well.
Okay, next question. Given the increase in insurance premium, coinsurance amounts, deductibles, and other limitations of cyber insurance policies, are you seeing any trends of companies or hospitals working directly with firms like yours to work through an incident and self-insure any financial exposures?
Yes. I don't know if I would use the term self-insure, but what we have seen is firms that are setting aside capital for this purpose. And we've even seen institutions, actually in pharma, we've seen institutions that actually purchase cryptocurrency holdings in advance because of the banking concerns that I talked about earlier. They're hedging and they're putting some amount of money in cryptocurrency in advance. Unfortunately, yes, and it's really unfortunate. The one thing I'll reiterate is, that list I had on the previous slide is this is almost 100% preventable. So while I'm a fan of being prepared and maybe even setting aside capital just in case, the best investment that anyone can make is in the prevention and preparedness. That is it. And just make it so it is not an issue. I'm on my soapbox, but yeah, make it so it's not an issue.
Okay, and note to our attendees, if you have a question from Curtis, please plop them in the Q&A box right now. Another question we have, Curtis, is, as a victim, how best can I prepare for a negotiation?
Well, so I sort of, iterated at the end that you probably want to have someone who does this all the time come in. And I did talk about this quite a bit as well. The best preparation that an institution can make for engaging with the threat actor specifically, not necessarily the whole incident, but that specific component, is having some matrix in place to quantify as best possible business impact. And this is sort of a nuanced thing, but one of the harder parts of my job is when I'm working with the victims is, sometimes the victims say, all right, Curtis, we're going to talk to the bad guy now. Get it to 0. Call me back. Well, the issue is there's a sliding scale of time and risk, and asking me to just get as close to 0 as possible is not a good business move. What you want to do is that process to say, like, look, we think that from a business perspective, it makes sense to pay up to this amount to solve this problem with the threat actor. After that, it doesn't make business sense anymore. Either we go out of business, or it's cheaper for us to restore, and those processes are very difficult to go through. And I'm super sympathetic to the companies that are in this situation. But taking a swag at it, taking a go at it in advance of an attack, or at least understanding the math that you would use in advance of attack is probably the best preparation you can have.
All right, here's a good question. Do these threat actors ever get caught? Why do we not hear about this?
Yeah, sometimes. But I will say that, my theory is, and I've been, because of my job, I end up getting asked questions like this by the media a lot. And I do think that a lot of it is theater. Most of the time, the actual perpetrators of these attacks, let's say 80+% of them are in the Soviet Union, in Russia or former Soviet Union countries that are Russia influenced, like Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine. And in those countries, they are provided some amnesty by their government. So they're not going to get extradited. We're not sending SEAL Team 6 into Minsk anytime soon, unfortunately. And as long as that's the case, this issue could continue. But yes, there have been cases where we had one last week where they arrested a gentleman in Canada. So yep, he got caught, and it is in the news. Because Ukraine is kind of divided. It's a very hot topic right now, so I don't want to touch on the politics of that. There's been several arrests in Ukraine where the U.S. and actually U.S. French government and the Ukrainian government worked together to raid some of these ransomware actors' operations. But all in all, most of them are somewhat untouchable at the moment. I actually meant to say this earlier in the thing. There's some interesting news that came out this morning. I haven't had a chance to investigate it, but it intimated that Russia has shut down access to Tor in Russia. If that were true, then the bad guys can't do their dark web marketplaces. They can't do that victim site I just showed you. It breaks a lot of their process. That doesn't mean they'll go away. It just makes it harder. But that's good. That's an impact. Not sure why that happened. And again, I don't even know if it did. You gotta investigate these things yourself. But that could be a good change.
Okay, we do.
So Curtis, I've got a question for you.
Of course.
And obviously over my career, I've done a lot of presentations with folks from law enforcement and folks from the Bureau, and the Bureau has, in my opinion, actually taken a very good stance in how they've approached this thing, and in terms of treating the folks who are hit by these events as a victim as opposed to something else, and which I think is the best way for them to approach it. But one of the things we hear sometimes is that they are able to help, meaning they do sometimes have the cipher that helps somebody decrypt their data. And the question I have is just in your experience, how often does that actually happen?
My experience has been very seldom, but I do agree with the first part of your your assessment of how they treat the victims. They are not punitive. They're not. They're very cooperative. They're very friendly. And you may know this, Mac, but they've now organized it in such a way for some time now where different FBI field offices are responsible for different attack groups, and they focus on those groups. So they are getting better at providing data about that. But the idea that they're going to be able to decrypt your files is a very rare occurrence. And there's explanations that in the cases that they have, there's some pretty detailed explanations about how those things occurred, but they're not. It's not sort of mechanical. They can't do that every time.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, Curtis.
Okay, we do have 2 more questions from the audience.
Sure.
First one: do the ransomware groups or actors ever get upset when you're trying to negotiate?
Yeah. Yeah. So we have a pretty tight button down process and system about how we conduct these things, and it is so some of the tenets of that process are for our team. And by the way, I'm not the only person that does these. I have a team of people who are quite good at this. But one is we are always polite, professional, and slightly deferent to the threat actors. I like to say we try to negotiate in all cases in good faith. And what that means is while deception is a tool in negotiation, it is a last resort tool for us, mostly because of what I said earlier. The threat actors have all the leverage. You can't lie about how much money you have if they have a copy of your finances, right? They have all of your files. So there's not a lot of secrets. You can't, and when you do, if you did employ some deception and they could prove that you lied, you lose a lot of credibility. And credibility is actually leverage. So while we do this, I think we do this very well, and most of our negotiations are very cordial, and they pretend it's a business transaction, and we pretend it's a business transaction, and it usually ends in a good result. Occasionally, they will use as a tool escalation threats, capital letters. They'll use expletives sometimes to try to get us to react. And those threats usually are they'll say things like, "Look, we're giving you one more day, and then we're deleting the decryptors, and you never get your files back." But here's the thing. At the very beginning of the talk, I mentioned that they operate a lot like a business and they want a return on investment. Well, they have an investment, right? They have spent time and maybe some money getting into your system and downloading those files and storing those files and getting you to come to their site and talk to them. All this is taking time. They want to get paid. They do something. They want something in return for what they did. And so in most cases, those are just threats. And knowing how to navigate those politely and say, like, look, we understand you're upset, you're in a hurry, here's our situation, and explaining it to them usually works out for the better. But yes, they do. Sometimes they get a little nasty.
Okay, that's actually all of our questions, Curtis. Thank you very much for your time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I hope it was valuable.
Thank you. Okay, and now on to Mac to wrap it up.
Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Can we go to the next slide? There we go. So first of all, before I start talking here, I'd like to thank both Alyssa and Curtis for their outstanding presentations today and their answers. I think it's pretty clear to me, and hopefully to everybody else who has been on it. This is a couple of people who know their business, who know this subject, provided a wealth of I think very helpful information. I hope that all of you can take that back and employ it in what you're doing and to help to make your preparations more productive. I'm going to touch on several of the things that they talked about as well, just to give you a little bit of color from some of our experience in terms of what we see working with folks in the industry. And one of the questions that was asked, and unfortunately, it was asked of Curtis, not Alyssa, so I'll answer it at least from my experience, and that was the issue of, do we see certain organizations looking at the cost of cyber insurance and considering options for self-insuring? And the answer is yes, we do. I've had several conversations with healthcare organizations who are looking at that and who are looking at the fact that, generally speaking, cyber insurance is only good up to a certain point, and that it is becoming very costly, and then oftentimes the catastrophic type events that occur that go beyond the small breaches typically are not covered, and therefore some organizations at least are looking at it and saying it may make a lot of sense for us to handle this ourselves. So I don't think that's widespread yet, but certainly there are some folks who have taken that approach. Let's go to the next slide, please. So, when we talk about this issue of responding to ransomware, and I think Curtis and Alyssa did a great job of talking about a lot of the things that they've seen and what's going on out there. And they've talked about the cost, and you can look at any number of different surveys or studies or examples of people looking at these costs. Bottom line is it's costing us all just way too much in terms of the impact, and so the better job we can do to avoid these kinds of incidents, or to be able to respond to them in a way that gives us the ability to anticipate or to power through and to not have our operations impacted to the extent possible, we all end up better off at the end of the day from a financial and other impact perspective. The thing that I always am concerned about and have worried about for some time, and now we've actually said, like I relayed in the question that I asked Alyssa, we've actually seen these attacks now at least start to affect things like operations, things that impact outcomes for patients, and in some cases they're even talking about perhaps increased mortality rates as a result of institutions that have been affected by ransomware. That is probably the biggest impact to our industry or to healthcare that I can imagine from these kinds of things, and probably the thing that worries all of us the most. When you look at what it takes for somebody to recover from these things, I showed you the slide that presented the financial analysis from the one breach. But the bottom line is that when we get hit with a breach that takes our systems down or offline and disrupts our operations for more than 2 weeks and beyond, it has a huge financial impact on the organization that has a tail on it that extends way after the incident is over. And oftentimes insurance is not gonna cover that for us. You know, and we look at this, we still, I mean, I think Alyssa alluded to it a little bit. We still have organizations, healthcare organizations, that are not budgeting, not investing in security in a way that is helping us be better at defending ourselves against a lot of these types of attacks. I mean, you look at the numbers still today, healthcare is spending anywhere from 1/2 to 1/3 what other industries are spending with respect to cyber security. And yet data in our networks and our systems are just as important, if not more important, in our industry than they are in a lot of other industries. And so I think one of the things that we all need to look at from a leadership perspective is our investment that we're making relative to protecting this very valuable asset that we're spending literally billions of dollars on in healthcare, and that being IT and data. Is it enough? Are we actually protecting that investment in our operations to the extent that we need to be? And then last but not least, you know, my particular focus and our focus here at Synergistic, as we work with a lot of the folks in the industry, is really on building better cyber resilience and better readiness. Because the difference between organizations that are impacted negatively when incidents occur, whether it's a ransomware attack or some other type of attack, is generally two things. One, how ready are they to react to that event, and can they actually react in such a way that they can mitigate the impact of the incident as quickly as possible and minimize what happens. But then secondly, how well can they manage time? Because that's really what it comes down to. How fast can you isolate it? How fast can you stop it? How fast can you keep it from spreading and affecting more of your operation or affecting your operation? And so that's really, to me, where I think most of our focus is, because I don't think I've ever spoken to a single CISO or a single CIO in healthcare that's ever said to me, Mac, you know, I really want to focus on the breach, or I want to focus on response to the breach. Most of them have said, I don't want to have a breach if I can avoid it, or if I can help it, right? So I think what we really need to do is focus on the front end of that. You know, we and Alyssa touched on this as well, and I think this is really important, and that is that most of these breaches occur not because of some overly technical or complex attack, but basically because of some something that we forgot to do, or something that we didn't do properly, like we didn't patch something, we didn't fix something, we didn't apply MFA to something. And they are typically known vulnerabilities. These are not things that we couldn't have done something about. And so a lot of times it's really this due diligence, it's this resilience that we build in by doing a better job of testing, by being more proactive in terms of how we approach our security, how often we validate the controls that we have in place and that we monitor. And her and Curtis both talked about that, how important that is to help us fend off these kinds of attacks. And I think that's really what it comes down to at the end of the day, is that the level of cyber hygiene that we have, for instance, in our environment is really important in terms of fending off a lot of these attacks that we're seeing that affect our organizations. Next slide. You know, this was a study that came out not too long ago, which I think just reinforces again what Alyssa was saying today, which is, number one, we have more and more organizations using cyber insurance today as a result of the number of incidents that are occurring and the cost to the businesses. And as a result, prices are going up due to more claims. The cost of this insurance is going up. She talked about increases that were in the hundreds of percent. I've actually heard of some of that, but the bottom line is, we regardless of what it is, whether it's 20, 30, 40, 100%, it's still an incredible increase that everybody is facing every single year, that they're covered by this insurance. And I mean, this year alone, speaking to some hospitals that we work with, we had hospitals that called us up after the quote ransomware rider showed up for them, that said they had to meet all these very specific requirements in order to get covered again or binded again. A lot of times they were told your insurance is going to go up 4 to 6x depending on how you answer these questions. And those questions were very, very specific. As she said, do you have EDR? Do you have MFA in place? Do you have a privileged access management or PAM solution in place? Are your email accounts filtered, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, it just went on and on and on. And some of these addendums with respect to ransomware, which are add-ons to the standard underwriting provisions, were 2 and 3 pages long. So what we end up with at the end of the day is that we're getting less, we're paying more. It's got more restrictions and more requirements to receive it. And if we don't meet certain guidelines when we're using it, we could actually not be covered, as you heard him say as well, in terms of who do you notify first, and do you really understand what your insurance policy says with respect to what you should do and when you should do it, and how that affects your policy. And that discussion around notification and communication is incredibly important. Communication in any of these incidents, in my experience over 40 years of dealing with negative or adverse events, is that it is always the best policy to communicate early, to communicate clearly, to communicate only what you know for sure, and to not postulate on things that you don't know yet, because almost invariably, as the investigation progresses, something will change, or you will learn something new with respect to what actually did occur, and it may change the outcome, or it may change the communication that you need to make, or that you want to make. And so you always need to make sure that you're communicating clearly, communicating what you know, and nothing more than that, until you know exactly what has happened. But to the extent about who do you call first and who do you put on notice, absolutely you need to put your carrier on notice the minute you believe that there's been an incident, because as they said, and we've seen this happen with folks that we've worked with, things start off as one thing, or start off as something that looks to be fairly minor, and then as you begin to look into it further, or you begin to investigate it, all of a sudden it completely changes its complexion, and there's evidence in the system that you did know about it, but that you didn't take action, and that can absolutely affect how organizations that are supporting you look at responsibility with respect to the incident. They talked about the OFAC list. There's actually 3 of those lists out there that have to be reviewed. And if you're not familiar with that, then that's not something you want to try on your own. That's something you do want to have somebody helping you with, because you don't want to get sideways with that. But at the same time, as they said and clearly said, that is not in and of itself a blanket decision that you can't pay a ransom, and I happen to agree as well. I agree that I don't like to see ransoms paid. I wouldn't. It unfortunately supports the behavior that is going on, but it's a business decision, and I think Alyssa alluded to this. But I know there was a number several years ago that was thrown around that said when a health system is down, the average health system is down for any period of time, it could be as much as $8,000 a minute in terms of revenue that's being lost. I'm sure that number is way up today, and maybe even higher than we expect. But knowing what that is, knowing what that cost is to us in terms of what is it actually costing us to be down, and not just cost in terms of revenue, but what is it costing us in terms of confidence in our workforce? What is it costing us in terms of confidence in our patients? What is it costing us in terms of potential impact to those patients? And you heard Alyssa say that the adverse impacts to patients is not part of that calculation from a cyber insurance perspective today. But I think as that data becomes more and more available, and those connections can be made more and more directly, I mean, that is going to be something that we as an organization or an institution have to take into consideration, because it's not just going to be the cost of recovering the data or recovering the system or recovering the revenue, but it's also going to be the cost of dealing with any lawsuits that arise from any adverse impacts to patients. And so that's just another element of this that as an institution, you're going to have to take into consideration. Can we have the next slide, please? You know, this is what I was talking about earlier with respect to the healthcare cybersecurity IT spend. We continue to fall further behind, and I don't really know what it's going to take for all of us to kind of get to a point where we say, you know what, we get it. We need to do something about this. Over 90% of our hospitals are reporting incidents. Good news is they're not all major, but the point is that they're all having them. And so, and we know how important and we know how much we're spending and investing in data and in IT, and how important that, critically important that is to our operations. At some point, the emphasis on cybersecurity is going to have to catch up in order for us to protect the business and protect our mission and to protect the investment that we're making. I just don't know what it's going to take for that to happen. But given the situation that we're in today with respect to insurance and the fact that organizations are beginning to think about, how do I self-insure? My advice in all of this is spend a little bit more on security and preparation and readiness, and your ability to mitigate the impact of these kinds of events, so that you're not having to have the massive payouts or impacts that perhaps you would have otherwise. I think that money can be best spent being proactive as opposed to reactive. Next slide. You know, and have some consideration for that individual in your organization called the CISO, as well as your IT organization. I mean, in today's environment, they have a tremendously difficult job. The attack surface that they're having to manage is expanding exponentially. The number of solutions that they have deployed in their environment that are providing information that they have to then find a way to correlate and understand what it's telling them about the risk is growing. The amount of analysis and other data that's coming at them is also expanding, but none of it is effectively integrated at the moment. And unfortunately, what that equates to at the end of the day is that a lot of times that individual, no matter how hard they're working, no matter how smart they are or resourceful they are, they still don't have a clear view of what their strategic risk is, or they have a fragmented view of what that is. And we as an industry need to invest more. And I don't mean healthcare in terms of this. I'm talking about the security industry needs to invest more in developing solutions that help those folks that are out there on the front lines do a better job of being able to clearly understand exactly where the risks are coming from, so that they can do a better job of hopefully mitigating those things. You know, but one of the things that both Curtis and Alyssa talked about that I am a huge supporter of is the tabletop, or what we do, or in addition to that, is an immersive exercise around incident response. And I would probably take a little different approach to this, because one of the things that we do with our customers when we do tabletops or we do immersive exercises is we always recommend that they bring legal to the table, that they bring their insurance carrier to the table. I don't think we had talked about bringing a negotiator, but after this session with Curtis, I think it might be a good idea to bring somebody with that level of expertise and experience as well, because I think the more you exercise, the more you practice, the more you understand what's going to happen and how to react to it, and the more you review those things and you build that muscle memory that allows you to react faster and more effectively in an incident, the better your chances are that you're going to mitigate the outcomes of that event. We absolutely encourage all of our health systems that we work with to go through tabletops, to go through immersive exercises. And one of the things that we've done this past year is we've actually expanded our immersive exercises to really address that catastrophic event, that outage that goes beyond 2 weeks. Because what we're finding is that even when we did the tabletops and the exercises in the past, organizations typically tended to focus on incidents that only lasted a couple of days. And in most cases, we know how to handle that, or we are prepared to deal with that. What we're not prepared to deal with, or are less prepared to deal with oftentimes, is those events that go beyond, that go past a week, go past 2 weeks, go past 3 weeks. And because they bring up an entirely new set of issues that we have to deal with. And it's best for you to go through those and deal with them in that exercise environment, so that you have a chance to go back and review what you're doing and your procedures and your processes and your training for your people to help them become more ready when, God forbid, something like that actually happens. Next slide. Last but not least, like I said, this to me is the real issue. Ransomware today is a patient safety care issue. When 600 people in this industry identify that these are some of the things that they're beginning to see as a result of ransomware events, this is a serious problem, and it's one that requires us to, in my opinion, to prioritize in terms of how we're going to address it, and making sure that we are to do the best job possible for the people that we care about. Next slide. So we need to shift our paradigm, right? Because we know it's no longer a matter if or when. We have attacks today, and we know they're happening. We know that the difference between those less impacted is readiness and time, and how well they manage that. We need to move from a reactive or compliance-based approaches to security to more of a proactive approach. Actually validating that controls are working, actually testing more often that systems are operating properly, and there aren't vulnerabilities that we don't know about. Things like compromise assessment. Typically, we do compromise assessments, or have done them in the past, after an event, to understand what happened. There's no reason a compromise assessment can't be done now to understand where something could happen, and then address that proactively. Insurance and response are necessary and valuable parts of the solution. Absolutely, you need people like Curtis and Alyssa in your corner. And they absolutely can make a difference in outcomes for you. And last but not least, increased readiness and resilience should be the focus of what we're doing, not just waiting for something to happen and then responding to it. Next slide. So with that, we'll open it up, I guess, for some general questions before we say our final thank yous to everybody.
Okay, no questions from the group yet, Mac. Let's give it a few minutes. If you have questions for Mac,
Can I ask Mac a question? This is Curtis.
Sure, absolutely. I got to ask you one.
Oh, nice. I'm going to pop on here too real quick. So are you, with your focus in the healthcare space, are you seeing a shift at sort of the board or CISO level in the prioritization of this? Is it still, are we still going in there and you're having to do a lot of education around this, or are people starting to have these conversations proactively?
So I think, Curtis, it depends on the size of the institution. Clearly, the larger health systems, this is absolutely a priority for them. It gets talked about at the board level. A lot of them actually even have a cybersecurity committee, as either a subcommittee to the audit committee or to the board itself. You'll see CISOs reporting to the board on a regular basis. It's a, when I was I actually advise various hospitals at the board level, and a lot of our folks in the company do that as well. So it is happening more and more than it ever has in the past. It's still kind of one of those things that I'm going to say something here that's going to sound bad, and it really comes down to you can tell what's a priority in a business by where they put their revenue, right? Where they put their treasure. So, it's one thing. It's good that we're having these conversations. It's good that we're hearing that it's more of a priority. We are hearing CIOs say, if I say I need something for cyber, I get it, which is fantastic, right? But when I still see the overall spend in the industry with respect to investment around cybersecurity where it's at, we're still not there where we need to be. And I think that's really what it comes down to. But I think part of it, Curtis, is we don't always do the best job of explaining or expressing the risk and the risk to the business when we talk about security spend. And I think that's something everybody needs to learn how to do a better job of, because my experience is that when you talk to a hospital board or a hospital executive team, and you can connect the dots clearly between something that needs to be done and how it can adversely impact the business or the mission of the institution, they take it seriously. It's when they don't really clearly understand the connection between those things, and somebody else in that room is making a better argument for where those dollars ought to be spent, that security loses out.
Yeah, I'd like to riff off of one of the comments, and that was, you said we're not doing a good job, and I agree that it is difficult in our defense to do that. I think you also mentioned that it seems to be more of a priority for the larger organizations. I think where we're losing out there is the media only talks about the big ones, right? They only talk about the large cases, and for every one of those, there's thousands of smaller cases that we don't hear about, which is where you get that sort of like, well, it's not going to happen to me sort of mentality. So I also think that the exposure or the amount of exposure that or coverage that's being given to the smaller entities, the smaller clinics or operators, is not doing it justice.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct, and that's one reason why we've always done things like this, because I hope that some of those folks have tuned in today or will tune in to the recording. Bringing folks like yourself and Alyssa to share your experiences with folks in the industry, I think is invaluable. Because oftentimes they don't necessarily, unless they're have an incident or in an event, they don't necessarily have those kind of conversations. Even when they're negotiating cyber insurance coverage, sometimes the CISO is not even directly involved with that completely, right? They're there, they review it, they they get involved at some level. But I think that having sessions like this to your point earlier is, yes, we are still having to educate. And I think the more we stay focused on that, things will get better. I mean, I look back at where we were, for me, starting my career in healthcare after my government career in 2001, and I look at the difference between 2001 and 2021. We're light years ahead of where we were then, but we still have work to do.
That's great. One last comment I was going to make is when you were talking about how the insurers are requiring, a lot of these controls in order to underwrite these policies. Another trend I've seen, and Alyssa may have touched on this, I can't remember, is that there, the traditional insurance writer is a questionnaire. Like to get the writer, you have to fill out a questionnaire.
Right.
A lot of the insurers are now moving to sort of a trust but verify model. So they're actually testing these things before, like they're testing about it. They want proof that you actually have enabled MFA. They want proof that you've got EDR on your workstation. So that also is sort of driving behavior, right? Because people want the policies, but you got to install this stuff first, or you're not gonna get the policy. So I've just seen a lot of that, which is I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, well. Anything that leads to a good behavior is a good thing, and to improvement is a good thing. And we have told organizations probably for a decade, get rid of elevated privileges, go to a vault, go to a PAM, don't leave those things out there for a bad guy to get their hands on and then to turn against you. But it's taken time for people because a lot of this stuff, it affects, as it affects workflow, right? And the minute you start making changes or want to make changes that affect workflow, people start to resist. The irony though, in this one, as you talk about elevated privileges, is that the people with the elevated privileges are the people responsible for the network for the most part, right? I mean, other than local admins. So you would think that of all people who would understand that having those things persistent on the network is not good would be those folks. But it's still, it has taken time for folks to do that. And when you think about, you talked about, those three things that if you did them, you would greatly enhance your ability to fend off attacks in terms of MFA and et cetera. And most of those solutions, they're not incredibly expensive anymore, right? And yet the impact of not doing it is far outweighs the cost of putting that in place. And the irony too is that every one of us has MFA in the rest of our lives, right? On our bank accounts and other things. And it's really funny. I used to present at a session with physicians, and I would say, how many of you, don't want to have multi-factor on your accounts, and they'd raise their hands, and I'd say, that's interesting, but you're okay with it on your bank account. You can do it there, but you can't do it on an EHR. And
right.
And it's like, you guys, you understand the answer here.
Right. You have to be good stewards of other people's data too.
That's exactly right.
Well, thank you, Mac. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for the question. Okay. So I think we're at the end of our time. So I'd like to close this out by thanking Alyssa and Curtis again for participating with us today and sharing their expertise and their knowledge and their experience. I hope all of you got as much out of it as I did, and recognize that obviously you were listening to two really experienced practitioners. And then secondly, I'd like to thank my team, and again, in particular, Lauren, who wasn't feeling well today, unfortunately, but still was a super trooper and helped us have this event. And I want to thank them for doing such a great job helping bring this opportunity to all the folks out there. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mac. Thank you, everyone.